Coming. Welcome to our Ask NPSMA series. Today we'll be talking about experiential learning and industry perspective. A few things first. Get this. There we go. So we have our national conference coming up in November. So that's November 1st to 4th in Tampa, Florida. And the title is Education, Science, and Workforce. Here, the link at the bottom it has more information for the conference, and also we strongly encourage you to register. And so Derek might be able to say a little bit more about this, but if you register in the next week, you get the deal.
Yeah, we've secured a discounted rate at the hotel of $169 per night plus tax, and if you register by this Saturday, you get that deal. So I think that's a pretty good incentive.
Yeah, so if you're planning to go to the conference, it would be best to register sooner than later, so before Saturday. Our president is here, Seema. Did you want to say anything about the conference? I think you're muted, though.
We can't hear you.
Yeah, I think you're muted, Seema.
My bad. I'm sorry. Is Terry, are you on the conference committee?
Yep.
Well, she would be more appropriate to speak about the conference.
What do you want to know? It's coming along great. Derek knows most of the details. We've got quite a few pieces set up, but there is one thing that I haven't finalized yet, and I'm looking for anyone associated with long-running healthy PSM programs who would want to be on a panel that can talk about numerous different aspects of a PSM program, including things like marketing. How are you being so successful? Tidbits that will be helpful to other PSM programs. So if you are going to be going and are interested in that, I'm going to be reaching out to a few of you, definitely, that are on my list. But if you want to tell me now that you're going and you will be on that panel, please do so. What day is the panel? Good question. Derek, do you have that pulled up? It's the first day. It will be the first day of the conference.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Mid-morning?
I
believe.
I'm working on pulling it up right now.
So Terry, I would suggest reaching out to Anirudh Chowdhury from Grand Valley, because he will be there. And ours have been running since 2005, 2006.
Yeah, I mean, I can help out too if you need somebody.
So that's 10:30 on Thursday, the 2nd.
And was that Dagmar?
Yeah.
I've got you on the list.
Okay.
So I'll be reaching out to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Terry. Thank you, everybody. So I hope to see you all at the conference in Tampa. In terms of NPSMA in general, you can keep current in the PSM world. Look for announcements and information in our monthly PSM email newsletter. And if you're interested in joining that, if you're not on that, just send me an email. I'll put my email in the chat after I finish this little introduction. We also have the Innovator, so you can share your best practices and see upcoming PSM news issues for deadlines and details. We also have the Chronicle, where alumni and graduates are featured. So if you're interested in featuring someone, please send an email to Dagmar. See her email address here. And if you're interested in getting involved on any NPSMA committees, really just ask any board member. Everyone is more than welcome in all the things that we do. Additional membership benefits, reduced rates to the conference. So we just mentioned, try to get that done by Saturday. Presentation opportunities for PSM students at conferences. We have a close relationship with the Council of Graduate Schools, which results in presentation opportunities and potential grants. We have our case in point, Ask NPSMA webinar series. And the key thing is to see that those are all recorded and available on our YouTube channel. So if you want to watch past Ask NPSMA sessions, those are up. And we also run PSM-focused virtual recruitment fairs. We are also on social media, so Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, as was just mentioned, and LinkedIn. So we encourage everyone to get involved and link to those different accounts. And with that being said, I will introduce our speaker, Ray Hubler. He has actually been involved with the NPSMA for many years and recently took on an industry position after being at the University of Utah. I think we said 6 years, 7 years, Ray.
Yep.
And so I will turn it over to Ray. He's going to talk to us about experiential learning with an industry perspective.
All right, let me see if I can make my PowerPoint here shareable. Or I might just have to share the screen. All righty. I'm going to assume that does that look good? We see is the screen being shared? The presentation?
Yeah, we see your desktop.
Oh,
The
thank you.
Picture of
that's
Marcel
not-
on it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that was not what I wanted to have happen. So let me stop sharing that, and I'll see if I can share the right thing. I assume that I could share like my entire. That's weird. Maybe I won't be using that particular item. We should have tested this.
Also, if you want to email it to me and start, I can get the presentation shared.
Yeah, tell you what, I actually had planned on, so right now nothing is being shared, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I can just talk to what I was going to say. There was nothing that complicated on the slides, and so we can just move forward that. So I just want to first off just thank Marcel and for inviting me today. So I really do appreciate the opportunity just to come back and join you guys, because I do miss this group. It always was something I really enjoyed when I was part of the University of Utah program. But as I've moved now back into my industry role, and I'm actually having the opportunity to work in this area of experiential learning on the employer side, I thought it might be a good opportunity just to kind of share with you guys some of the things that I'm seeing, and perhaps just open up or broaden the discussion so that when you're thinking about these types of opportunities for your programs, you can bring in or have a little bit of additional outside perspective from that. And so I think everybody here knows me, right? So as Marcel said, my current role is I'm the director of what is called the AIX Expert Development Program at Applied Materials, and AIX stands for Actionable Insight Accelerator, so it's not anything to do with AI. Although the programs I'm working with are primarily in the area of advanced data analytics. And if you're not familiar with Applied Materials, we're one of the leading semiconductor capital equipment producers in the world. It's about a $25 billion company with 33,000 employees across the world. And it's a pretty dynamic and large organization to work with. I should also mention that anything I say here today are my own opinions and not anything to do with Applied Materials. So prior to that, as Marcel mentioned, I was at the University of Utah for 6.5 years, and I really enjoyed being able to work with the TSM programs there. But my background before that, I had about 15 years of industry experience, primarily in the semiconductor industry, but in a number of technical and product marketing and program management type of roles. So, and I did have some experience within those various roles, working with college students, mostly in the area of what I would call traditional internships, and not this area of experiential learning. So, one of the things I hope we could just discuss, or we could just kind of highlight, is I think there's a real gap in the knowledge of what people associate with experiential learning. And the thing that we're fighting against is how people view traditional internships. So when you're thinking about the traditional internships, basically these are students that are being managed through a very structured process, right? There's a human resource person that's they're usually tied into the human resource group. The projects themselves are managed by the employer. And so if you think about the type of engagement, even though we're working with university students, the engagement with the university is really quite low. And so when we think about what we're trying to do, or what I was trying to do at the University of Utah, this area of experiential learning is there's the questions about who's actually going to manage the work, right? And from an industry perspective, some of the things come down to who actually owns the project, because there's a lot of issues that get tied up in that. But unlike a traditional internship, really the engagement with the university needs to be high, because typically, at least in the cases that I worked with at the University of Utah, things I'm doing now, the students are taking courses as part of, usually for credit, and the work that they're doing really does not fit in well with what you would associate with the traditional internship program. So I think that's really one of the kind of the key challenges, is really differentiating between those two different models. And so one of the things I just wanted to bring up and kind of lead the discussion on was that as we think about experiential learning and how we're going to manage this, I think it really is somehow that the universities and companies are going to have to figure out a new model around how we do projects that are going to address the various needs of the stakeholders. And maybe we can talk a little bit, within the group about who those stakeholders might be. But kind of a couple of the key concerns that I think get lost from the university side is, in terms of like employers, is how do you educate people about the role that the students are playing, how that it doesn't necessarily have to be an employment role. And when you get into technology companies, you really need to have a way of addressing the IP issues. And we can talk a little bit about the different IP issues that are there. And then on the other side, the universities, I think that it's the university programs really have to be able to put themselves in a position to understand their concerns, and that is that these programs are more of mentorship opportunities for people, for the people working in the companies, right? So it's always a great opportunity to be able to work with students, but also in terms of like, how do you define appropriate topics? Because the scopes of the projects can be, really need to be adjusted in a way that's not typical of an internship program. And then I think the other thing to really figure out is, how do you address the quality issue? Because typically the projects that students are working on as part of an experiential learning are really different than internships, because typically these projects are being used for grades. They're being used as part of their graduate exams or part of the, a thesis type project, even if it maybe isn't a thesis. And so I could go on and talk a little bit about some of these things, but I did want to kind of try and drive this more as a discussion. I thought that would be good. And really just want to open up the floor and ask for the people who are on the call here, kind of like, what are the things you would want to know, or how, from an industry point of view, what would you like to ask somebody, like how to get things started, or what are the concerns that are going on for us? I'll start with that. This is where I do what I do with my students when I'm teaching, right? I grab my cup and I wait for people to ask questions.
It looks like Tim has his hand up, but I think we can probably just jump in. So Tim.
Okay, I was just trying to be nice and polite and raise my hand, but so you talked about the IP issue, and I think I missed something about sort of whether companies will hire students as interns as opposed to, I don't know, as opposed to what. So what I'm thinking about, so we've got an engineering program here, and we'll have our graduate students, some of them do research with the faculty, but some of them will actually work with local companies. And when we do that, we have them, we create industry-sponsored graduate fellowships, and the industry partner pays the university money for tuition, but then they hire the student directly and pay the student for the hours they work. And for us, that solves the IP issue, because it's now all in-house with the company. And so that student is an employee of the company, and that sort of gets rid of that potential headache for the company and for the university. And I guess my question to you is that something that you see as as normal in the industry when they're hiring interns, or is that an unusual thing, or does that help solve the issue, or
So I think that's a good solution to the problem. I guess my question back to you would be is, how do you ensure that the project that the students are working on are going to meet the requirements of your program?
Right. So we will have a faculty member who is the academic sort of overseer of that project. And most of these companies are ones that we have good relationships with already. So they don't mind having a faculty member who visits once or twice a semester to talk to the student and to talk to the person who's sort of mentoring or overseeing things and getting, in many cases, details of what's going on. Because I know a lot of this stuff is proprietary, so a company doesn't necessarily want to talk to a faculty member. And I guess in our case, we have enough of the enough of a relationship, and then, if necessary, non-confidentiality agreements. But it also depends upon how you define what the outcomes need to be. You know, you can define them, I suppose, in ways that are pretty vague, so that lots of things will meet those requirements too.
I mean, within the companies that I've worked in, the internship programs were always, managed through human resources, and the positions were very much along the lines of, I would say, entry-level type of positions. So not necessarily appropriate for graduate level type projects and work. And I think that's one of the challenges for the traditional internship, right? Is who is the intern, who are the interns? And I would say that master's level students are typically not the target audience
Right.
for a lot of programs.
Yeah,
so then you have to have that you have to have that relationship to build that out. That also sounds like the way you're doing it with an individual mentor, faculty mentor is maybe not very scalable, right? In terms of the number of people that can do
Right.
that. Then you've got to have the faculty mentor, involved, as opposed to, say, a program director for a program director.
Yeah. I mean, we're doing these on the scale of maybe half a dozen a year, so it's not huge by any stretch.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm aware of a program now at UC Berkeley, which has hundreds of students in it, and they're placing hundreds of students into projects. Most of them are undergrads, upper level undergraduate type of projects, but they are approaching it more along the line of an experiential learning opportunity, and I think it's an interesting model. They have they have a number, they have a fairly large staff supporting this endeavor, first off, and but they also have a pretty good process in terms of, like, they've developed a memorandum of understanding, which basically dictates that they don't own any of the IP, right? So that puts that part of the way. They encourage their students to sign NDAs, and they also, work with the companies to make sure that the program has signed NDAs. So that kind of handles a lot of the IP issues. And then it is still challenging from within the company to basically design the project in a way where you're still, even if you have NDAs in place, you're trying to mitigate risk, right? The risk of loss of whatever intellectual property. And so then you still have to have kind of people who want to participate on the business side, who want to be those mentors, and who are, supporting the type of engagements. So I think that one of the things is that's a bit more scalable, right? Because now it's pretty, if you can pull a couple of people from a couple of companies and everybody's on board, it's more manageable, and it might be a way of thinking about how to scale that. So I think that there's there's the traditional way, which I think is along the lines of what you're saying through the traditional internship programs. My kind of thing that I'm looking at is like, all right, my HR group or the HR groups I've worked with in the past have no clue about kind of like the requirements of master's programs or even upper level graduate programs. And so part of it is do we have to train them, or in some cases, if it's not dealing with employment, like in this case of the Berkeley program, there's no employment contract with the students. They're paying for class credit. This is just part of a class. And so the projects are all done kind of on a more informal basis with the company.
Say we have run into problems with HR and a traditional internship program, and often you have to do an end around and talk to the people who actually want the person in there because they see it as a talent pipeline, and then they can often work with their HR department to be able to make an exception to it.
Yeah, I mean, you can find that way to make the exception. You can also just, I think the biggest hurdle sometimes is just the whole dealing with IP issues and being able to put a program in place where everybody understands just like how it's going to work, how you're going to protect IP, how the students are going to be treated, how that it's not employment, that it's part of a class program, and making people aware of those, of what it is that the students are actually trying to get out of the program.
We actually have something like this at WPI, though not at the master's level. So I'm involved with we call it our Wall Street Fintech Project Center. So our undergrad students have a senior project, and at WPI our semesters are split into terms, and they can do an entire term. It's B term, so it's coming up in the second half of the fall, where they focus on one project, and we bring in projects from different industry sponsors that the students will work on. Now, sometimes they may be on site. Pre-COVID, they were always on site. Now, sometimes they're on site, either in Boston or in New York. But it's a bit complex because on one hand, you have the students doing this work for the sponsor, and then on the other hand, as you've both already mentioned, that they have to be satisfying this degree requirement. So it's work intense for the faculty advisors. Mm. So these are interdisciplinary. So it's typically myself coming from math, data science, a colleague from computer science, and a colleague from business, and a few other colleagues here and there. But that core group, the three of us, co-advise all of these things, and it's that's the bottleneck in terms of scalability, because I think 7 of these things next term, which means at least 7 one-hour meetings with the students, plus a bunch of other meetings thrown in here and there. So it's not something that we can. If we start to scale it beyond the 25 students a year that we have now, then it just requires more colleagues to get in as advisors. But we're able to kind of satisfy all of these things because the advisors are so heavily involved.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that there's the opportunity for within these programs in terms of scaling and helping to scale is the idea of having group projects. So where students are working as parts of teams, and that really reinforces what's happening in an industry perspective, right? We don't work typically, there's a few people who work as individual contributors, but even if you're an individual contributor, you're typically part of a matrix organization where you have a deliverable to a team, right? And so one of the things that I think that I'm seeing as being successful is when you have groups of students working on as team projects, then they're actually able to kind of distribute the work between them, so that things don't fall behind, right? If somebody gets stuck with an exam or a class, then they're able to, the other members of the team are able to kind of keep things running, keep things rolling, and keep the projects on task. So, one of the things about encouraging, from an industry's perspective, is that's going to encourage people to do it is to have success in the projects, right? Because if you have a project that gets stuck and doesn't have success, then there's little incentive for the industry people to commit, 2 or 3 people an hour a week, because normally it's not just an individual that's committing to a project. It's usually a manager and a couple of the team members from that. And, that's a time commitment that they're making. That's, their resources that they're allocating to these projects. And so you want to kind of have built-in success, right? How can I ensure that that these projects are going to be successful, that the sponsors are going to really find value in the work that's being done? And I think that's something that's just careful planning, and also just careful scope of projects for people to do that. And so I would just encourage people to think about, if you're thinking about, how do I try and scale things, or how do I make them more manageable, or how do I make them more attractive to an industry sponsor, really trying to understand the scope of a project that you and what you can do, having a team of students who can, be part, can deliver on the project, would also be something that would be helpful. And just, you were talking about marketing earlier. I would say that, having a one-page slide in a JPEG or something like that, or a PDF, something that pops up that's easy to see in an email, can go a long ways in terms of, because the people in industry, the people I work with, the people I've worked with in the past, how do you get this in front of them in a way that they can quickly digest it, and they're going to make a decision pretty quickly about whether it's something they want to do, right? And so really kind of defining in one slide what that message is. I've seen some other programs unrelated to the NPSMA, and they send out a 10-page Word document that's really dense text, and you want to talk about a document that does not get read. It's like, I read them because I like, I like to see what people are talking about, but I know I'm the odd duck. And then when you're talking with, when I've thought about what I've done in the past and how I work with my colleagues, it's usually about what's that one-page message I can give about why I want to do something. And so I would, these are things that are coming back to my mind now as what I used to do and what I'm doing now. And so, I'm just trying to think of the things that could be helpful for that. And I think, addressing upfront issues of IP is really good. Addressing issues of whether or not you're looking for students to be employed, because sometimes you want that, sometimes it's not necessary if it's a class. Whether or not you wanted this to be a sponsorship, right, where you're expecting companies to, make a financial contribution to a program, right? Some companies probably can do that, others can't, right? And it might be good to know ahead of time whether or not a company really has the mechanisms to do that, right? I will say that the companies I've worked for in the past none of them had those mechanisms in place, right? So it would have had to be created something new. But I know that other programs, NPSMA programs have had success, PSM programs have had success having sponsored programs. And so, finding out who those companies might be can definitely be something, but figuring that out before you make the ask.
Curious, sorry.
All right, no, go ahead, Tim.
I'm curious, Ray. So, have you mentioned that there are companies that have had this sponsorship where they have sponsored a program. To me, that's more a development conversation that happens, in a different part of the university as opposed to a program director going to a company. What might that conversation look like for a program director asking for I found that it's easy for me to ask them to create an internship, very easy to ask them to hire my students, because I'm not in the development world, in terms of asking funders for money. I'm just like, what does that conversation look like? And how have you seen it work, even if it's not something your company does, but you've seen other program students?
Well, I mean, here's where I probably haven't seen that work, right? But I'm just trying to think. I know Deborahs Programs at Rutgers. She's had success in having, funded projects. And I'm going to assume that those are through some high-level personal relationships, with various companies. That can't be emphasized, the developing those personal relationships and looking for opportunities. When you get to larger and larger companies, people get more and more isolated, so it gets harder and harder. It's easier to get in touch with people like me as opposed to getting in touch with the CEO. And so, there's interesting stories there. We'll have to wait for the next NPSMA when we're having a beer. But it's definitely a challenge, right? And I think, my encouragement would be is that I think there are more people out there like me who have some ties to their universities or university programs, and helping them understand what they can do, because I think a lot of people don't realize what they might be able to do. They don't know how to ask. They don't know that their HR group, that they could approach their HR group and ask them about, like, what are the processes. A lot of technical people aren't do not have a lot of business process knowledge. And so kind of encouraging them to learn or to explore those business options, I think, is something also to remember, that you can help people understand who they might talk to initiate a project, that, okay, you might need to talk to HR, but then you might need to talk to your legal representative in terms of how you would handle IP, right? And just get people comfortable with the idea that they might be able to actually do this type of work. I think that's if I had a take-home message, is like, don't get frustrated with people in industry because it's difficult. Help them understand how you've seen other people be successful with projects and programs, and give them some guidance on how to make it, how they might be able to make it happen at their place, that they're in their companies. Because I think there are people who want to do this type of work, who want to sponsor students, who would enjoy mentoring students and enjoy working with students, but most people don't have kind of the background about how it works, and they don't know where to start. And so kind of figuring out how to start that conversation and giving them some guidance in terms of what the expectations are for the projects, and how they might approach their HR people, and how they might approach their legal teams. I think that those are the types of conversations that can just get things started.
I think Beth wanted to make a comment or ask a question.
Yeah, so I am from Rutgers, but you're right. We have this very large program. We don't call it an internship, we call it externship. And what it is, it's group-based, so this way we can get more students involved. And the projects are very they're scoped out to be a semester long. So there's a lot of work that goes in to make sure that the students can complete a project within a semester. And it's a class. They're not employed. In some cases, there are NDAs signed, but we try to get around that. And that, what we found is that actually limits the scope and the industries that we can go into. Like pharma is very difficult to go into for any of these projects, because pharma is always like, they want NDAs. And again, it's really hard we have someone that actually, that's their job. They go out and they scope out these projects and scope out these companies to try to get relationships with. We also tap into our alumni a lot, which is pretty fruitful. But I just kind of wanted to share that, just to see.
No,
it really helps your perspective and stuff. Like I personally am not intimately involved with the externship program, but it's like this monster. So yeah, it's a lot of work, man. That's all I know. So thanks.
Well, and I think that's having a different label for it is probably really helpful.
It is from the university side too, because internship implies employment, right? Yeah. And we especially get into challenges with that with international students and visas and sponsorships and all that kind of stuff. So it's a really good avenue, at least for our international students, to be able to get some kind of exposure to an industry setting. And in some cases, they do flow over into internships or job offers or things like that. But it's kind of a good like opening foray, so to speak.
Yeah, I saw Megan had a question.
Oh yeah, well, I was just going to add to Beth's point. So our students complete practicum projects, semester-long practicum projects every semester, and I am the person that coordinates those projects. And to your point, it is just a lot of boots on the ground and sending emails and having meetings. And, to Ray's point, essentially, I have a slide, I have a little spiel that I send out, and Really, it's just kind of luck of the draw. We have what we call return customers. And so we have some of the larger companies that we work with pretty periodically. We only work in certain industries every other year, so we're not overwhelming the same companies. And then, yes, with pharma, we're working with pharmaceutical companies this semester. And yeah, the NDAs, can be a little complicated. We have an office on campus that I basically just send our partners their names, and they negotiate the NDAs on my and my coworkers or co-instructors' behalf. But yeah, with like industries like pharma, I get a lot of no's because, right, of the proprietary information. But I also think they are like internships, just they're larger, but they have 4 and 5 students that are working on teams with them. And so they're able to complete a lot more in a shorter span of time.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And then you also have to think a lot of the companies, they don't want to give a bunch of students one of their very critical projects to run. They want to give something maybe lower level, less impact. So you have to kind of negotiate with them to make sure the students get some value out of it too. But coming from industry too, like the speaker, I think that working on a team is great, because you don't work in industry without being on a team, and the students really get a lot out of it. And if the students do a really good job, that's how you get the return customers. So it takes a lot of work from the academic side to make sure that they're, doing what they're supposed to be doing.
So I did want to riff on 2 items that came out, I think, Megan's comments. One, the idea of not overwhelming your sponsors, because I can tell you, I've only been back in a year, and there's been a couple times where I've been a little overwhelmed, and I had to pace myself, right? I basically, had to set it up like, I'm willing to do this once a semester, once a year, like, and I'm actually managing helping manage 2 projects right now for a school. And it's, that's a sizable commitment of time, right, and effort, even though it doesn't sound like it on paper, right? Because there's more planning that goes on behind the scenes than what not. So I think that's nice if you think about how to start that out. And I actually had to kind of chide the program a little bit and tell them, it's like, hey guys, you're being too aggressive in how you're approaching us, and a little bit of, I had to manage them a bit. But they were just like so enthusiastic, which is good, which is a good thing. The other thing is just in terms of like, when we talk about NDAs, I think it's good to realize what just in terms of like what that is. So when companies typically have NDAs, like a unilateral NDA, what that really is doing is like, it's really acknowledging, it's like, we have confidential information. If confidential information is shared with you, then you have a responsibility to protect it. It's not that we're not going to share confidential information with you. It's that you are we're entrusting you to see this, and which means you have to treat it a particular way. Primarily means, you can't keep it, use it, distribute it to other people, things like that, right? And so helping some students understand, what is an NDA and how it's used and why is it important, and why we use it. But then the other thing to think about is there are creative ways to work within an NDA. And I mean, and just as an example, this is something totally unrelated to anything I did, but I actually saw the paper that was published on it. And it was a business type of project that a student did. They did it with Intel. That's how I kind of came across it, because Intel's, the big giant in our industry. And, the student did a bunch of work on a finance project. And then when they did their report on this, they basically synthesized a data set, right? So it was not the real data set. It was acknowledged right up front. This is not the data set that we worked with the analysis, but this data set represents the type of projects or the types of problems we were trying to solve from that. I have to go back and review the paper for some of the details, but I thought that was a really creative way to do it. I think in data science, a lot of projects can be Data sets can be standardized and normalized and worked around pretty easily. For other things like in pharma, maybe it's a little bit harder because you're dealing with, proprietary molecules, but maybe go back to the old organic chemistry trick of just saying, I've got R and I attach it to a functional group, right? And you don't have to talk about what R is. You can only talk about maybe some of the interesting things on the end. So I think there are creative, I think people could be creative about how they work within confidential information. So Megan.
Yeah, so our workaround with that is we have our students, they define their scope and goals with the companies at the beginning of the projects. And so we as instructors and the companies as mentors kind of understand what the overall deliverable will be. And then our students have 2 presentations at the end of the semester, one to the company, one to the class/public. And those are 2 very different presentations. And so whatever they're doing at the company, I'm not there. It's only for the company, but the company then provides us feedback midway through the semester and then at the end of the semester in terms of the students meeting those scope and goals that were determined at the beginning of the semester. And so for that allows us to do an assessment without requiring the company or the students to communicate any information that they might not want us or the class or whomever to know.
I think that's the challenge, right? Is like how can we work within these confines? Because I think it's possible to find solutions that satisfy both the industry and the academic institution. But it takes a little bit of work. It takes some creativity. And Marcel, did I see your hand up?
Well, yeah, and this is making me think of there's a little bit of risk management that you have to do. When you mentioned our Ray, our students hired, or is this for credit? Beth, you mentioned that you have this externship type thing, and I would guess that many of the students are probably hired. There can be a lot of value of this with the students being hired, because this happened to me once, where we had everything in place for a project. We had NDAs in place. The students were starting to work, and then someone from the compliance department, from the sponsor, found out about what was going on, took a look at it, stepped in and just blocked everything. Say, these students absolutely not can be looking at any of this data unless they're onboarded. And the solution there was to just hire them and get them onboarded to be employees. But if you set these things up, it's a good idea to make sure that the sponsor runs it up the chain, because it can be a disaster if you're in the middle of the semester and then somebody from risk or compliance steps in and says, just put the brakes on this whole thing. Because once that academic term or semester begins, time is very, very precious. And if in industry, you can have people say, oh, this will just be delayed by a month, whatever. But for a student who's doing their project in a semester, that can be catastrophic.
We work with startups in the spring, and that's always a breeze because there are like 4 people that you're working with, and they basically make all of the final decisions. And so like this semester is a headache, but next semester, I don't even have to try very hard to get companies, because startups are so willing for extra, hands on deck that, they're willing to partner with us.
Yeah, and having worked I worked in a startup at one point, and I had, the CEO would come to my lab, right, and he'd say, "Hey, man, what's going on today?" And it's like, "Oh, I want to bring in a person to do an undergrad to do a project." And he's like, "Great, go talk to John." And and the bureaucracy was much is much easier than when you get to larger companies where, yes, you have a compliance office, and some people don't even know that, right? Or it's so when you're talking with somebody new, and I think Tim, you asked the question about. Let me go find your question really quick, because I think it tied into that. How do we convince companies to take on international students? That has been a problem for us lately. So we'll come back to international students. But making sure that people, like, if somebody is like an alumni of the program and they're like, oh, I want to be able to sponsor a project, helping them understand, right, who do you need to talk to, right? It's not probably just your manager, right? Because your manager is probably going to be on board for, whoever that is, whether it's a director or a VP or whatnot. They'll probably support you in that, right? most people are really excited to have the opportunity to support academic projects. I haven't seen a lot of people like just totally shut things down. I think the problem comes is like, well, how do I get this approved through my organization, and helping them understand, okay, you should talk to your HR group, make sure that do they want to bring these people on as paid, or do they want to have them as unpaid, right? As on a project. Some companies are, it sounds like, are very, no, we want these people to be paid. That gives us a level of protection. Where some other companies would be like, okay, it's not part of our normal internship program. So, make sure legal is okay with it, right? And then making sure people understand that, that who are the stakeholders within the company that need to sign off on these things. Larger companies, it's probably, 2 or 3 different organizations that might need to do that. For international students, Tim, I mean, part of it I think is just companies that are, if you're working with more larger international companies, they're probably, wouldn't they be less less adverse to working with international students as opposed to smaller US based companies? I mean, I'm kind of curious as to where the pushback is.
So the pushback for us is they prefer domestic students over international students. And what we found is that there's most of the companies that are certainly local here don't understand that if a student gets their STEM master's degree, they're eligible to work for 3 years without a visa. And so all the companies are worried about, now I'm going to have to sponsor this person and I'm not going to be able to get any work out of them. And you say, no, 3 years. And by the way, if you look at your turnover, everybody you hire leaves in 2 years anyway. So this is actually better for you. And making that convincing argument has been difficult for us.
Yeah. I mean, the unpaid positions, would that be with that as a,
No,
as
this
a
this is mostly with getting them in maybe in an internship that would roll over into a paid position, or just getting them a paid position after they graduate.
Okay. Yeah. Understanding. I mean, it sounds like it's just a matter of educating people on some of the rules around international students. And again, I think maybe having that as a line in your 1-page item there might be helpful. Natalie, I saw your hand.
Yeah, I think that's highly dependent on the employer too, because we've obviously had that issue for a long, long time. And since COVID, employers that I've been working with are much more willing to have those international students. Now, the international students are not going to get, we do summer internships, so they're probably not going to get placed in the fall, but when those opportunities are still open in March or April, they have a lot more success in competing for those positions. We also work with our advisors to help with their personal connections with employers for those positions. The flip side of it is that yes, the students on a STEM can work for 3 years, but if the student wants to stay longer than that, we're also doing them a disservice by placing them in a company that's not going to sponsor them eventually. So we have to balance that a little bit. But I have seen some movement since COVID on how international students are being placed, and a lot more of them are getting full-time positions.
We're almost to the top of the hour, so I hope this was a helpful discussion. I mean, one of the things that I hope you guys all realize is that if you ever, just want to reach out and ask a question or chat, if you feel like I have something that I can contribute, I'd be more than happy to hear from you. I think part of the, having come back into this now and seeing how even I'm having to educate people on how universities are trying to work, student projects and experiential learning into their programs is something that most of my colleagues, and I'm sure my past colleagues, are just not familiar with. They're thinking of the old models of, academic internships, or, people would where people would go away for like a whole semester or for a year and do an internship with a company and then come back and finish their last year. So the more traditional definitions of internship, I think, are the challenge that if that's not, if that's not your model, then you're kind of outside of the box from what they're used to seeing. Recognizing that you have to you might have to go beyond HR, right? Depending on the type of project, and also that sometimes, for the different industry partners, HR may not want to be involved in it, right? And it might just be totally in terms of mentorship opportunities for the people that are working in the company, and making sure that, and then always just being ready to address the compliance issues, the IP and compliance issues that might pop up. Becoming experts on how that works within the companies that you're working with would be kind of my take home messages and guidance on that. Personally, I enjoy working with students, and I'm actually glad that I still get the opportunity to do that. But it was something I basically had to do and lead the effort on, right? It wasn't something that was going to be necessarily supported without a little bit of pushing some things through and asking people, well, what's the risk, or how do we get things done? Or it's like, I want to do this. Why can't I do it? What do I need to do to make it happen? And, I have a different perspective than most people because I came out of the organization, but I think there's other people out there that, like me, who just need help in and giving them the guidance on what, finding ways to help them get things done can go a long way to creating the opportunities that we want. So I hope that wasn't too much rambling.
No, this has been great. Does anybody have one last question or point before we wrap for the day? Oh, yep, Melissa.
Thank you. This is very good. I'm Tola Sadek-san from University of District of Columbia. We have a PSM program since 2010, long time, like still running the professional science master program. Yeah, internship is really a key part of what makes PSM really unique and successful. So definitely we need experiential learning, internship. So other way of engaging, industry into the program is really through the advisory board. If you have advisory board, select your advisory board based on this need, which is really the experiential learning. Is for me what works the best. I don't have to worry. The advisory board will find a way, work through HR, whatever needed. And so that way I can get help than me try to, go through the HR. Yeah, that is really, HR doesn't want to involve because they have to do so much work. And they don't know even sometimes when the student come from international, of course, so much roadblock. So they don't want. So there are, the advisory board always look for interested group or person, like how they can get, benefit from the program. So that's the best what working for me. So like mine is really like, sometimes also depend on the program really. For me, it is environmental program or resource program or environmental sustainability. Pharma, all these, yeah, in the biotechnology area is completely different industry, different approach, and it's different. So like what's work for environmental program may not work for the biotechnology industry. So for us, there is no such a limitation in what the student can access and what they don't, because they don't have much access, that is restricted access in the environmental program, especially in the water or wastewater industries. They go to the lab and they're involved in the all kind of analysis.
I think the Workforce Advisory Committee can be a valuable resource for helping place students. I don't know if it could be like the resource because I don't know how scalable that would be, but it's definitely I definitely, when I was at the University of Utah, relied on some of my Workforce Advisory Committee members for some key, for some key projects and things like that. So it's definitely, I agree. It can be a valuable resource, especially if you give it to them up front, right? Hey, I may need you, I would like you to be able to consider, bringing on students for these learning opportunities. Yes, making it just part of the ask when you ask them on the board to join the committee.
Okay, well, with that, I think we're just about at the end of the hour. So thank you so much, Ray. This was wonderful. This was really, really informative, and I think a very nice discussion.
No, I was glad to have the discussion. Hope it, just helps kind of keep the keeps things moving, because I've been in your shoes. I know it's a really stressful, hard thing to do, but hopefully, just knowing that there's people out there who really do want to help and contribute in these ways, and so I think we can just continue to make the arguments that it's works. It's good for the students. It's good for the employers, and it provides a really valuable experience for the students in particular.
Yeah, I agree completely. Well, thank you again, Ray. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
No, it was good seeing everybody again, and those of you that I haven't met before, it was nice to meet you.
Okay, nice
See you, Ray.
See you, Ray.
All right,
Bye,
have a good
everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Hi, everyone.